Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire here in the background. Recently, a lot of people have sent me requests to do a comparison between a Mini-14 and an AR platform, so here we are. And when I say a lot, I do mean a lot, I don't mean one or two. Now, this comes with one very big caveat, and that is I know that no matter how I do such a comparison, I will be inundated with hate mail telling me that the comparison wasn't fair. I'll do everything I can to make it as fair as possible, but I know it won't be fair. Now, that having been said, the Mini-14 I'm going to use today, you'll notice it has a flash suppressor. Mini-14s don't typically come with flash suppressors from the factory, but the previous owner installed one, so we're going to leave it. And I'm going to use this particular Mini-14 for one reason, and that is because this is the rifle I happen to have. Now, with that, of the many different types of ARs, what would be the best one to use to make as fair a comparison as we can to this Mini-14? Well, the Mini-14 was introduced to the American market sometime in the 1970s. You know, it seems to be a matter of debate as to exactly when. Sources disagree on that point. But we can say that it was introduced in the 1970s, and even though they're still being made today, I would say that the high point of the Mini-14's popularity was probably in the 1980s. So I'm going to compare it to a 1970s, maybe 1980s AR platform. This A1. Now, I want to make mention of caliber and ammunition. This Mini-14 is marked as caliber .223 Remington. This AR is a .556 NATO, but all the ammunition I'm going to use today will be caliber .223 Remington. And the first thing I want to discuss is power. If I measured right, this Mini-14 has an 18.5-inch barrel. This AR has a 20-inch barrel. So to what degree, if any, will power be affected by the 1.5-inch difference in barrel length and the design differences of these two rifles? Let's go to the chronograph and see what we can learn. I have my chronograph set up at 7 yards, and I have my Mini-14 loaded with Remington green and white box, caliber .223 Remington, 55 grain full metal jacket. Let's see what kind of velocities we get. .2894. .2956. 2968, 2996, 2946, and 2944. Now let's see how the AR compares. And now our A1 platform with the same ammo. $29.65, $30.69, $29.94, $30.55, $30.49, 3,000, 3080, 3080, and 3081. Let's try a different type of ammo. Now I'll use Federal American Eagle caliber .223 Remington, 50 grain jacketed hollow point. $30.49, $30.96, $31.03, $30.87, $30.64, $30.73, and $30.55. Now let's see how our AR performs with that ammo. And now our AR. 3183. 3192. 3155. 3195. 3189. 3148. And 3200. Now let's go crunch the numbers. Well, I crunched the numbers and it comes with a couple of caveats. When shooting the Remington ammunition through the AR, you notice that I got the same velocity twice in a row. When that happens, it's indicative that the chronograph may have malfunctioned, so I threw one of those out. Also, there's the caveat that chronographs don't always agree with each other, and certain environmental factors like ambient temperature, barometric pressure, and elevation can affect chronograph results. So that having been said, with the Remington ammunition with the Mini-14, I got a mean velocity of 2950. With the AR, it was 3036, a gain of 86 feet per second. With the Federal ammunition, remember this is a 50 grain bullet, not a 55 grain, so we would expect higher velocities. And with the Mini-14, we got a velocity of 3075. With the AR, it was 3,180, a gain of 105 feet per second. Now, sometimes when I'm chronographing handgun rounds, I'll say that this is 100 feet per second more, and that's a lot more. Well, it is when your velocity is down there around 1,000. But a gain of 105 feet per second when your velocity is around 3,000 to start with, that's certainly more, but is it significantly more? That's debatable. So we saw that our A1 with a slightly longer barrel gave us slightly more velocity. And so we could infer that if we were using an AR carbine with a 16-inch barrel, that it would give us slightly less velocity than the Mini-14. Yes, it will, and if you want a more in-depth analysis of that, we do have a presentation where we do some chronographing with ARs with 20 and 16-inch barrels. But now I want to talk about accuracy. Typically, when comparing the accuracy of two different firearms, I'll load them with identical ammunition, shoot at identical distances, at two identical targets, look at the size of the groups, and make some conclusions about accuracy. However, in comparing the accuracy of a Mini-14 and our A1, there's a lot more that goes into it than just that. There's going to be some caveats and some yabbits and a punchline or two. So I would ask everyone to watch this segment in its entirety before making any commentary about the comparative accuracy of a Mini-14 and an A1. Now what I'm going to do is shoot these two targets from 5 different distances: 25, 50, 100, 200, and 300 yards. I'll shoot 5 shots out of each rifle at each distance, so when I'm done I should have 25 hits on each target. At 25 I'll shoot offhand, at 50 I'll shoot from a bench rest, and at 1, 2, and 300 I'll just shoot from the prone. I'll shoot the target on your left with the Mini-14 and the target on your right with the A1. And the ammunition I'm going to use is Remington green and white box 223 Remington 55 grain full metal jacket spear point. And again, I want to reiterate, please watch this segment in its entirety before making any commentary on it. So all that having been said, let's start from 25 yards. I have our shot holes covered with these yellow pasties, and it would appear that at 25 yards shooting offhand, I can shoot the A1 a little more accurately than I can shoot the Mini-14. Now let's go back to 50 and shoot from bench rest.
Now I have the groups covered with the green pasties. You'll notice they're a little higher. I was aiming a little higher so I wouldn't shoot the previous group. Also, it would appear that even though we've doubled our distance from 25 to 50 yards, the groups seem to be just as good, if not better. Remember, now I'm shooting from a bench rest, not offhand. So now let's go to 100, shoot from the prone, and see what kind of results we get. Now I've moved to the 100-yard range, and we're starting to get a pretty good breeze, but at 100, that shouldn't make much difference. Well, with both rifles we have all the shots in the 5 ring, but this time it looks like the Mini-14 has a better group. Let's go back to 200. Now you see with both rifles the groups have shifted over to the left a little bit. That could be the angle of the sun, could be just me, it could be because we're getting a little bit of a breeze blowing this way. Also you see a difficulty in keeping it centered in terms of elevation. That's just because you're trying to find the center of a target that doesn't really have much of a center. But we can see in this case our A1 is holding a definite better group than our Mini-14 is. Now let's try 300. Well, here's our targets. Now we have our 25, 50, and 100 yard targets on the bottom, and our 200 and 300 yard targets on the top. Mini-14 on the left, A1 on the right. Now in comparing the accuracy of these targets, there's two ways that we can score them. One, by just number of hits, and two, by using the scoring rings on the target. Now I fired 25 rounds with each rifle, and with the Mini-14 we got 20 hits out of 25. With the A1 we got 25 hits out of 25. As far as using the scoring rings, that gave us a score with the Mini-14 of 91 of a possible 125. With the A1 it was 114 of a possible 125. Now when you start breaking these things down, you see that at 25, 50, and 100 yards, there wasn't very much difference. It really starts to show at 200, marked on our upper targets with the yellow pasties, and where it really showed was at 300, marked with the green pasties. With the A1, I fired 5 shots at 300, got 5 hits. With the Mini-14, I fired 5 shots at 300, got 1 hit. So it would appear that our A1 is the clear winner. And there's a few other things we have to take into consideration. Of all the AR platform rifles you can buy, when you buy not a carbine but a full-size rifle, most of those are going to fall into one of 3 categories, an A1, an A2, or an A3. I'm using the A1, which is generally considered to be the least accurate of them. Not only that, my particular A1 has a terrible trigger pull. And the Mini-14 is a 223 Remington, and that's what we're loaded with. My A1 is a true 5.56 NATO, but we're loading it with 223 Remington ammunition, and many people will tell you that if you load a 5.56 with 223, it'll work, but it's going to cost you some accuracy. So even though we're trying to give the Mini-14 some advantages, the A1 would appear to be the clear winner. However, this entire process is one of the yabbits I was talking about. Let me see if I can explain something. I want to take a few minutes to talk about how the sights on these two rifles work. This is a subject I could go on about all day. I'm going to try to condense it to just a few minutes, but even at that, it's going to take a few minutes, and this is going to be the boring part of the video where I talk, and you're going to have to put up with my speech impediment and my Shatner-esque pauses. That having been said, both of these rifles have PEEP sights. The Mini-14 has what I would consider really conventional sights. You have a front sight blade, it's about 1 inch above the bore. You adjust for windage and elevation on the rear sight. Now the A1 has a front sight post, and people will debate whether the blade or the post allows people to shoot more accurately. To me, it makes no difference. But this still has what I would consider conventional sights. Now, the way you zero a Mini-14, and different people will do it different ways, but mainly what you do is, when you get the rifle and you have no idea if the sights are on or how close they are, you want to start with a big target and shoot at it at a really close distance, like 15 yards. Shoot a group, see where the group is, make adjustments. If you started out shooting at 100, it's possible your rifle will be so off you just miss the target completely. So you shoot it at a close target, get it to where you're pretty close, and then you can set the target out there at 100, do some fine-tuning, and zero it. If you zero that rifle at 100, because the way the sights are made and the flat trajectory of 223 ammunition, anywhere from 5 yards to 100 yards, you're never going to be very much above or below the line of sight. And you'll still be pretty well on out there to 125, 150. It's at 200 and 300 you're getting some drop, and you have to compensate for it. Now, by contrast, the way the AR sights work and the way they're adjusted is very different. And forgive me if I say AR sometimes and say A1 sometimes. Now this A1, the first thing you'll notice is that the sights are really tall. They're very high off the barrel. This front sight is 2.5 inches off the bore. And people ask, why? Well, on the Mini-14, the action spring is under the barrel. On AR platform rifles, the action spring is in the stock, so it has to be parallel with the action, so the stock can't slope down, it has to be straight. Your face is higher, the sights have to be higher. Now the way these sights are zeroed, and there's different ways of doing this, I can just tell you the way I learned it. You adjust for elevation on the front sight, windage on the rear sight. And to zero this, you first start with putting on what's called mechanical zero. You flush out your sights and then put 15 clicks of elevation and 17 clicks of right windage. Some people use different numbers. Again, that's how I learned it. Then you click up your long range sight. It has 2 rear apertures. The long range is marked by the letter L. Now once you've done that, That mechanical zero will get you pretty close at 25 yards. Remember, it's an A1. Then you shoot a group adjust, and to get yourself dead on at 25 yards. That puts you theoretically on at 300 yards. Then you take your rifle out to the KD range, shoot at 300, do some fine-tuning if necessary, and you're on at 25 and 300. How can that be? That's where this first grade drawing comes into play. When you look at the target, your line of sight is straight. The travel of the round arcs. The barrel is not parallel with the sights on the A1. It's angled up. And so as you shoot it, that projectile goes up and then it arcs back down. As it goes up, it crosses the line of sight at 25 yards. That's why you're on at 25. It goes up, it arcs back down, and crosses the line of sight again at 300. So you're on at 300. Now that sounds great, except wouldn't you be kind of high at 150? If you zeroed it like this and then you went out and tried to shoot a coyote that was 150 yards away, you'd probably shoot right over him. How do you adjust for that? Well, remember, we got this using the long-range sight. Flip it back to the short-range sight, and now you're on at 100. And because of the dynamics of this sighting system and the trajectory of 223 or 5.56 NATO ammunition, when you've got your long-range sight up, you're on at 300, and you have your short-range sight up, that's going to put you on at 50, 100, 150, 200, and even a little bit past 200. Now, that sounds like a good system, and it is. But in doing the drill we just did of shooting at 25 through 300 yards, and I'm standing here making it appear that the A1 is far more accurate than the Mini-14, especially at the longer distances, not really. What really happened was, at 25, I just put up the long-range sight and I'm on. At 50, 100, 200, I go back to the short-range sight and I'm on. At 300, I go back to the long-range sight and I was on. As where with the Mini-14 zeroing it at 100, I was on at 25, 50, and 100. You saw that the groups between the two rifles at those distances, there wasn't enough difference to really talk about. But at 200, even though I know I'm on with the A1, with the Mini-14, I know I'm going to shoot low and I have to start compensating for it. At 300 with the A1, click up the long-range sight, adjust for the wind a little bit, aim at the target, fire. With the Mini-14, I had to go by, okay, I know I'm on at 100, so at 300 I'm going to drop a certain amount and adjust for the wind. And so instead of aiming at the target, I was aiming somewhere up here. You don't get a really good group when you're aiming somewhere up here. And this is where the sights on the A1 and the design of it really lend themselves to shooting accurately on KD ranges. So as where I showed those targets and say, the A1 is the clear winner, only because that test was made to show the exact format in which the A1 can be better. And in a lot of formats it is. Now when I said that the A1 is more accurate than the Mini-14, that's one of those yabbits we're going to come back to in a few minutes. But for right now, although I make it sound like this type of sighting system is superior, and again, it is in many ways, there's some real drawbacks of that type of sight being that high off the barrel compared to this type of sight, which is right down there pretty close to the barrel. Let me show you what I mean. When using the A1 in the field, I usually keep the short-range sight up because I think that shots at 50 to 200 yards are going to be more likely than shots at 300. However, even though it's called the short-range sight, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to hit exactly where you aim it at very short ranges. I've got my two squirrel targets set up here, and I'm going to shoot them from 20 yards. And I'll shoot the target on your left with the Mini-14 and the target on your right with the A1. And let's see what kind of results we get. Now I've got the shot holes covered with pasties. I only used a couple because it didn't take very many pasties to cover the shot holes. But we can see that depending on the distance and the target, sometimes the sight design of the Mini-14 can have a significant advantage over the sight design of the A1. Now there are those who would argue that this isn't relevant because neither of these rifles is really made for squirrel hunting. Okay, let's do this drill again with a target that might be more relevant to the members of the What If Brigade. Now this is what I call the Son of William Tell target, and let's say that he were being held hostage by that apple, and the SWAT team was going to try to rescue him, but perhaps one of the members of that SWAT team, armed with an A1, didn't understand the dynamics of how the sights work. So now all you members of the What If Brigade can see that it is really important to understand how your sights work, and sometimes there might be a very significant advantage to the sight system on the Mini-14. Now there's one more thing I want to say about accuracy, and earlier I said there was a yeah, but this is it. This is also the real punchline of the thing. What we've seen so far is that the A1 appeared to be significantly more accurate at distances like 200 and 300 yards. But then we saw that's really because of the design of the sights, not because the barrel's any better. When shooting the Mini-14 and the A1 next to each other at 25, 50, 100 yards, and then just shooting offhand at those squirrels at 20 yards, it would appear that the Mini-14 is just as accurate. So in the argument where people say that Mini-14s are terribly inaccurate, that their accuracy is far less than AR platform rifles, or those people that argue the other way and say that Mini-14s are very accurate, where does that argument come from? Let me explain a little bit about my experience with such things. Having spent a career in the military and having owned a couple of AR platform rifles, I have fired extensively A1, A2, M4 carbine, a few different versions of commercially available ARs from manufacturers like Colt, Fabrique Nationale, Harrington and Richardson, Bushmaster, and probably a couple of others. When it comes to Mini-14s, I've owned a couple of them, and there was a time when everyone in the crew had Mini-14s, so I have fired extensively, I'm going to say 10 or more Mini-14s, so I'm fairly well experienced with both platforms. Now let's take a little bit of a trip down memory lane. Back in the days when Duran was still on the charts was when I got my first Mini-14, and I can say that that particular rifle shot just as accurately as any AR I have ever fired. And so at that time, when that rifle was my only source of data, and I would hear people saying, Mini-14s are inaccurate, oh, they're terrible, I would think, no, you're inaccurate, you're terrible. Well, as time goes by and I got to shoot other Mini-14s, what I discovered was that with some of them, I could hold a group. With some of them, I could hold a group. The accuracy of Mini-14s is not so much good or bad as much as it's inconsistent. Yes, I know, and we're coming to that. And I'm not really qualified to explain the design and construction that makes them that way, but on the topic of head spacing, I've heard it said that the head spacing on Ruger rifles, they're all different and they're all wrong. If you get one that happens to be correct, it's through happenstance, not design. And it's because of that that not just Mini-14s, but Ruger rifles in general, some people will say, well, yes, they're very accurate. Yeah, because either he doesn't know what accuracy is, or he happened to get one of the good ones. As where other people will say that Rugers are very inaccurate, because some of them are. At least that's been my experience. And when it comes to Mini-14s, that's what I've seen. And that's part of the debate why people will say they're accurate or they're not. Now, according to what I read, and sources don't always agree with each other, sometime in the late 1990s, Ruger changed the design and construction of Mini-14s so the inconsistency of accuracy is supposed to be a thing of the past. Well, that may be, but there's still a lot of Mini-14s out there that were designed and built anywhere between the early 90s and the mid-70s. So, are Mini-14s as accurate as AR platform rifles? Well, within the confines of what their sights allow them to do, if you're not trying to do precise target shooting at 300, 400, 500 yards, and if you happen to have a good Mini-14, For all practical purposes, yes they are. If you happen to have a poorly built Mini-14, well, no. So I think we've beat the accuracy horse to death a couple of times. Let's move on to another subject where these two rifles differ significantly, and it's quite a point of debate: the magazine. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In talking about magazines, we have to have a brief discussion about reliability. We'll talk a little more about reliability later, but for right now I have to say that for any auto-loading rifle that utilizes detachable box magazines, the quality of that magazine is inextricably linked with the reliability of that rifle. And as magazines relate to the reliability of Mini-14s, we have to take another trip down memory lane. The Mini-14 was introduced in the 1970s, and at that time Ruger was making 20-shot magazines for it. But a few years later, when we were rocking out to Hungry Like the Wolf, when I got my first Mini-14, they were no longer making those mags. My only choice for Ruger Mini-14 magazines was the 5-shot mag that came with it, or some cheap knockoff aftermarket mags. So I bought a few aftermarket mags, mostly 30 shots. And what I found with the 4 aftermarket mags I had was that they worked perfectly. Now the problem is that the only data I had for Mini-14 accuracy and reliability was the one rifle and the few mags that I owned. So when people tell me Mini-14s are not accurate, yeah they are. Mini-14s are not reliable. No, you're not reliable. Mini-14 aftermarket magazines are of poor quality. No, you're of poor quality. Well, problem is I was half right. And it's a thing about math that when you're 50% right, you're 100% wrong. And as time goes by and more people I knew got Mini-14 and aftermarket magazines, I started seeing the problems with reliability as it related to those magazines. Somebody I knew wanted to have 7 working magazines for his Mini-14. He had to buy 14 magazines to get 7 that worked. One of my crew that I talked to in preparation for today's presentation, he had a Mini-14 some years ago, and his recollection is that his Mini-14 malfunctioned constantly. Well, the problem is he's the kind of guy that he went out and bought one aftermarket 40-shot mag. It wasn't a particularly good one, so his Mini-14 malfunctioned a lot. That's just his recollection of it, but based on that one mag. Now, let's fast forward to literally today. This morning I was at D&B Supply and I see that Ruger is now making extended magazines for their Mini-14s. And at D&B Supply they had manufactured by Ruger 30-shot Mini-14 magazines for $50. Now by contrast, they had a bunch of cheap knockoff AR platform magazines for $10 a piece. Well, people will say you get what you pay for. Well, in Mini-14s, you have to have a good magazine to make the thing work right. While I've found that for AR platforms, just about any cheap knockoff magazine I buy, the great majority of them work just fine. You can't get much more of a cheap knockoff than the military issue magazines, and I've found that they work extremely well. When they haven't worked, it's because they've been stepped on or bent or damaged. So in the argument of quality versus quantity, I can get a whole lot more AR magazines than I can good Mini-14 magazines, and quantity has a quality all its own. Now that having been said, let's explain a little bit about how the magazines go in the rifle and how these rifles work in terms of magazine use and magazine changes. When you're going to load your AR, you press your slide lock, pull your bolt to the rear, push your charging handle forward. Then you take your magazine, and you notice I feel the top of it, put it in the mag well, it locks, hit your slide release, and it chambers around. Then I'll hit my mag release, take that mag back out, feel the top of it again. What I'm feeling for is that the top round was on the left side, now it's on the right side, so I know that first round went into the chamber. Hit your forward assist, close your dust cover, make sure your safety's on, off you go. Now for the Mini-14, it's kind of the same, but quite a bit different. Your bolt lock is on the top. Press that down, pull your charging handle to the rear, let it go, it locks in place. To put your magazine in, the magazine has a hole on the front of it which links up with a peg inside the rifle. And you rotate that forward, put it in there, make sure that peg is lined up with that hole, and rock it back till it clicks. Then, to release your bolt, pull your charging handle to the back, let it go, and it chambers around. You can pull it back just a little to do a press check, make sure that round's in there, make sure your safety's on, and off you go. Two little bit different ways of doing the same job. But the real thing comes to changing magazines. Now I want to discuss two types of mag changes, your tactical reload and your speed reload. Tactical reload is you got your magazine in your rifle, you fired a few rounds, you want to top off, so you'll take that mag out, but you want to keep it, you don't want to lose your mag and it still has rounds in it, and you'll put in a whole complete new magazine that's fully loaded. Now on AR, the way you'd typically do that is I'll grab my extra magazine and I'll hold it low on the mag, press my magazine release, pull that out, put the new one in, click it, put the old magazine in my pocket. Now I'm fully loaded again. The problem is when doing that with a Mini-14, it can be a little more difficult. Your magazine release is a lever you push forward at the back of the magazine. Now there's a couple of different ways to do this. Now you notice I can't reach the magazine release without completely changing my firing grip. So I'll put one hand up here, change this grip. Now I will grab my extra magazine, again, hold it low on the mag, push my mag release forward, get that out of there, rock my new magazine into place, put the other magazine in my pocket. Now there's a different way to do this. You can use your left hand to get the magazine out, so I don't have to change the firing grip with my right hand. But that means that I have to grab the magazine, push it forward with my thumb, rock that out of position, then get this magazine out of the way before I can get my new magazine, and then get that in the mag well, rock it into the right place. Some people can do that better than I can, but for me, that way of doing it is a little awkward. In fact, both of the ways that I do it is a little awkward. Now, in terms of doing speed reloads, we'll just presume that you're going to shoot till your magazine is empty, your bolt locks back, and then you'll get rid of that one magazine, just let it drop on the ground, and reload with a new magazine. So let's do a couple of live fire drills and see how the Mini-14 and the A1 compare to each other. So let's start with the tactical reload, and we'll start with the A1. Not bad. Let's try that again. Now let's try that with the Mini-14 and see how it compares. And now, let's try tactical reload with a Mini-14. Okay, that wasn't bad. Let's try it again. Perhaps a little slower, and I can tell you it took a lot more practice to do it, and it requires a lot more care to make sure you don't damage the magazine while doing it. Now, let's try a speed reload. With the speed reload, we'll shoot till the mag is empty and the bolt is locked back, then we'll eject that magazine with no intention of keeping it. Not bad. Now let's try that with the Mini-14. And now let's try with the Mini-14. Not quite as smooth. Let's try that again. And we got a malfunction. And now it's just empty. So the Mini-14, it looks like for a speed reload, at least for me, was not as smooth as the A1. Earlier I said you'd have to put up with the boring part of the video where I talked. Well, that was just a preamble to this really boring part where I talk a lot. Now there's a few more things to cover. One is that I was going to do a demonstration of disassembly and reassembly of these two platforms, but I'm not going to, and to be perfectly blunt, that's because this presentation has already gone on a lot longer and become a lot more tedious than I intended it to be. But the short version is, the Mini-14 is easier to disassemble, and when you disassemble it, there aren't nearly as many tiny parts as there are with the AR. Also, AR platforms, if you have one of the new versions with the gas piston, it's not so bad, but if the generation that has the gas tube, they will carbon up a lot faster and a lot more severely than a Mini-14 will. They need a whole lot more lube than a Mini-14 will, and they just need a lot more PMCS. If you do the PMCS correctly, they're going to be just as reliable, if not more so, than a Mini-14. But there's no question that in terms of disassembly, reassembly, and doing PMCS, the Mini-14 is a lot simpler rifle to operate. Also, the complexity of how you zero the sights on an A1 platform, the Mini-14 is sighted in a lot more like a conventional rifle. Now, that having been said, everything we've done up to now really looks like it's showing that in our comparison of these two, the A1 platform is the clear winner. And there are people who will erroneously or dishonestly say that I'm biased, that I wanted the AR platform to be the clear winner. No, I didn't. There's also people who will say that because I have a lot more experience with the A1 than I do with the Mini-14, it was more accurate for me and I could change magazines better, and that it's not really that the rifle's any better, it's just that I have more experience with it. Well, you got to remember that I have owned Mini-14s off and on over the years. This rifle is mine, and I did a lot of practice with it in preparation for today's presentation. So the idea that I have a little more experience with the AR platform, so might do better with that, that might have some merit, but not much. Now, all of that having been said, other than being a simpler rifle to operate, does the Mini-14 have any advantages over the AR platform? Yes, actually a few. This is an A1. Now, an A1 is lighter than an A2 or an A3. According to textbook, this A1 weighs 6.5 pounds. According to the manual I read, this Mini-14 weighs 6.4 pounds. That's not much less, but it is less. And it's going to be significantly less than the A2 or A3 platforms of an AR. So the fact that it's a little lighter might be an advantage to some people. There's also an advantage in the legal aspect, and not just black letter law, but in the way the law is perceived by some people. There are some jurisdictions, and I can't quote you chapter and verse of which ones, but there are some jurisdictions where AR platform rifles are prohibited, but Mini-14s are okay. Yeah, go figure. There's also the case of the way people interpret law and interpret what is or isn't okay. Let me tell you a couple of Joe stories. And for those just tuning in, yes, Joe is a very real person. Way back when we all had Mini-14s, the one I had was virtually identical to this one. Mine did not have a flash suppressor. Joe bought one, again, just like this one, but he modified it. He put on an aftermarket pistol grip folding stock and a flash suppressor. So even though his rifle and mine were, in terms of their function, identical, his looked more space age. And there were several occasions where we were out doing our thing where we would meet people and they'd look at my rifle and look at his and, what kind of rifle is that? Not understanding that our two rifles are essentially identical just because his looked scary. There was an occasion where Joe and I were traveling in two separate cars. He was following me. I went through a green light. Well, he didn't want to get stuck, so he ran the yellow a little too much and got pulled over by the police. He had his tricked-out Mini-14 with him, loaded, which was 100% legal in that jurisdiction at that time. But when the police officer saw that, he, in Joe's words, freaked out. And remember, Joe and I were both in the military at the time. And this police officer started going on about, "You can't take your AR off post." And Joe tried in vain several times to explain to him, it's not an AR, it's a Ruger Mini-14. Look at what's stamped on the rifle itself. It's a Ruger Mini-14. To no avail. This police officer calls back up. The second cop gets there and the first cop shows him the rifle and says, "Run the serial number on this AR." And I'm sitting here about a block away watching this farce unfold. Well, they ran the serial number, and they finally determined that they couldn't show that any law had been broken, and they had to let Joe go. Of course, ordering him to unload and disassemble the rifle and put it in the trunk of his car. And that kind of thing is a problem you might run into when you have a scary looking rifle like this. Now I want to emphasize, I don't want this to be the format for everyone to complain about the police. The police represent themselves as highly trained professionals, and usually they are. It just so happens that the police officers we were dealing with on that day weren't. Now I want to tell you another anecdote that has nothing to do with Joe, and this is really sad, but it still makes the point I'm trying to make about Mini-14 versus AR platform. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was on the range and the Boy Scouts showed up, and they're going to do something with shooting .22 rifles and pellet guns. And there's a bunch of kids there and there's a bunch of adults there. And one of the adults pulls out this break-action pellet gun. Now, some pellet guns have a compensator at the end of the bore. It looks like some sort of suppressor, but it isn't. Well, this pellet gun had one, and it had a really simple rudimentary scope on it. One of the adults is holding this pellet gun, and one of these 12-year-old kids looks at him and says, quote, "Is that a sniper?" Now, he was trying to say, "Is that a sniper rifle?" but he couldn't quite get the whole sentence out. And this adult, with a look that was a combination of shock, horror, disgust, says to the kid, "It's a pellet gun." To which the kid replies, "But is it a sniper?" Now, granted, he's a 12-year-old kid, and we hope that he will grow into a more informed adult. But there's always the chance that he's going to grow into an adult that's just as ignorant as he is now. And whether as an adult or as a 12-year-old kid, when he sees you leaving your house and going out to get in your car to go to the range with a scary-looking gun like this, he might be the kind of kid that runs in the house and calls 911 and reports, "I just saw someone with a machine gun!" And things like that can become a very big advantage to having a Mini-14. Now, earlier I said that there was a time when everyone in my crew had Mini-14s and now we all have ARs. And the question comes up, why did we all have Mini-14s and why did we switch? Well, the reason that we all had Mini-14s was due to our erroneous thought that the Mini-14 was significantly more reliable than an AR. If you do proper PMCS, no, it really isn't. But the big reason we all had Mini-14s was because at that time, Mini-14s cost less than half of what AR platform rifles cost. That was a big advantage. However, it isn't anymore. Just this morning, I was at D&B Supply, and they had several different versions of AR platform that ranged from $1,600 down to $650. Well, what would a Mini-14 cost? Well, James got on the computer, and he said he could sell me a Mini-14. There were a couple of different versions, one for $750 and one for $800. When I can buy a very good AR platform for $650, that's not cost effective. So what was at one time a big advantage for the Mini-14 certainly isn't anymore. So this comes down to, why would someone today select a Mini-14? Well, there's a few reasons. One, maybe you just like it. Two, the local laws in your area or how people perceive the rifle. Because this rifle doesn't look so scary, because it's lighter. And you know, you just might select a rifle like this for the same reason as I discussed earlier, that people select a PPK because it's what James Bond had. Maybe you'd select a rifle like this because you're a die-hard fan of the A-Team, or maybe you're nostalgic for the 80s. Maybe you have a mullet and you still wear parachute pants. And if that's the case, the Mini-14 might be the rifle for you. But because I live in a jurisdiction where rifles like this one are perfectly legal, and my neighbors aren't quite so prone to panic, and I am not nostalgic for the 80s at all, the Mini-14 is not the rifle for me. So, if you've sat through this entire presentation, thank you for your attention. And as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the Mini-14 versus A1 platform video.